believe if we can hold to this format, everyone will leave here tonight enriched. We'd like to thank the Doubletree for their generosity in giving us this venue for free. It is a great gift, as I've said on many occasions, and as we shared with our speaker tonight at the Doubletree, this particular hotel was ranked the #1 hotel, Hilton brand hotel in the world.
Really?
So, we had some infamous news about being the poorest city in the country, and we have the best Hilton brand hotel in the world. So we're very thankful for that. Now I'd like to introduce Steve Osmond, who will introduce our speaker for the evening, Reverend Dr. Steve Osmond.
We're really glad you're here. Thanks for being here. So I'm trying to think when I met Dr. Koosed. Doctor doesn't deserve that. Probably 25 years ago, I met her husband first, and then got to know her. She was a professor in the religious studies department at Albright College, still is there, but she just told me that she has a much loftier position now, so she can explain what that is. But we've had her at Calvary a number of times to do wonderful presentations about the Hebrew Scriptures, and always enlightening and interesting and really wonderful. So I'm going to let her tell you about her new job and let her speak. Thank you.
Steve, give me one second. I forgot something. There are papers on the either end here as well for email. You can put your email on there if you haven't already done so. Do it legibly so that Harry, who keeps the record of the emails, will know what the email is. Pieces of paper. I have pens on me if you need them. So that's it.
All right, I've got this on. Can you hear me? Oh, okay, excellent. I do talk with my hands a lot. Once after a class, I don't know if you can see I'm wearing a Fitbit, right? Once after a class, it logged 60 minutes of elliptical. Okay, that's great. Because I haven't been to the gym in years. I'm so glad to be here with you today. As I was introduced, my name is Jennifer Koosed, and I teach at Albright College, although I have recently, just a month and a half ago, been moved into administration, so my current title is the Assistant Vice President of Academic Affairs. Certainly it sounds fancier than it really is, but I appreciate it. And of course, I have to tell you, Albright College is not closing, right? Okay. There's been a lot of rumors about our demise, but those have been over-exaggerated. So the recent Red and Eagle News article was actually accurate, which is always good. And we are indeed not closing. So I'm going to talk to you today about this topic. And first I want to begin with an imaginative exercise, right? So imagine you are out for a walk, and you turn a corner, and you suddenly see 4 creatures. And these 4 creatures each have 4 faces. One of these faces is human, one is like a lion's face, one is like an ox's face, and the last like an eagle's. They each have 4 wings, and under each wing is a human hand. Their feet are hooves. They sparkle all over like burnished bronze. There are flames shooting up around them, all around. The sound of their wings is loud and rumbling. And to top it all off, they're covered all over with eyes. E-Y-E-S. Would you be afraid?
Yeah.
What I've been describing is the biblical cherub. Not the contemporary chubby little white baby with a couple wings sticking out of his back, right? That's what we often see on like Christmas cards or other types of images. Instead, this description comes from the book of Revelation and the book of Ezekiel. The descriptions are so fantastic, right? This is actually just a little bit of a summary of these descriptions. They're much longer. The descriptions are so fantastic that it's actually really hard to picture these creatures. And here are a few artistic renditions, right, trying to capture what the book of Ezekiel and the book of Revelation say about what these creatures look like. The strange hybrid nature of these creatures, as well as their shifting portrayals, right, suggesting that they're shapeshifters, contribute to our inability to imagine them. Their bodies are simply not legible. And how do we feel when we don't understand something? When we encounter something that doesn't fit with our normal, everyday categories? Well, in general, we feel afraid. And I think if any of us met one of these on the street or in the woods taking a walk, our first response would be unmitigated fear. So I teach a class called Monsters in the Bible and in Literature. So I usually co-teach it with a colleague in the literature department. And in this class, we look at monsters. We look at monsters in the Bible, like Leviathan, giants, the whore of Babylon. We spend some time on Satan. But we also examine strange and fantastic and terrifying creatures that are created by God and do God's bidding, like the cherub. Right? These are angels, but they're not what we normally think of in our contemporary moments when we talk and hear about angels. So cherubim are first mentioned in Genesis 3. They are the creatures that God sets up to guard the tree of life after Adam and Eve get booted from the garden. Right? I'm going to assume you're all mostly familiar with that story, right? Okay, good. If I say something and you're not familiar with it, just wave me down, and I will give you more context or explain it a little better. So the cherubim are set up to guard the tree of life. And all we really hear about them is that they guard this tree with flaming swords. Right? Cherubim are actually mentioned in the Bible over 90 times. So they show up quite a lot. They are carved into the tabernacle, right, the Ark of the Covenant. And they are also in the temple. So they do statues of them in the temple. They surround God in both Ezekiel's vision of the heavenly throne room and in John of Patmos's vision in the book of Revelation, again, of the heavenly throne room. In all cases, it seems as if these creatures guard thresholds, right? You have to pass by them and through them as you move from the human realm into the divine realm. Right? They are the guardians of the thresholds. And in all cases, they raise some complicated and sometimes troubling questions about how we define and designate the monster. When I begin my class, Monsters in the Bible, after we do a little bit on, what is religion, what is religious studies, what is literature, how do we study literature, right? Our next questions are always about monsters. What is a monster? Does something or someone get labeled a monster because of how they look? Certainly, these are scary. They don't look like anything we know, right, that we can categorize easily. What kind of appearance is considered monstrous? Would you have called these creatures a monster? had you encountered them in the woods, on the street, or wherever?
Yeah.
Or does something get labeled a monster because of how it acts? And if you label something a monster because of how it acts, what kinds of acts are you defining as monstrous? And what does it all even mean? When we talk about monsters, it can be helpful sometimes to begin with etymology. Right? I'm a scholar, right? We always like to know where words come from and what they meant in their original context. So monster is from a Latin word, and as you can see here, it means the Latin word is monstrum, which is related to the verbs declare, to show or to reveal, and monere, to warn or portend. Monsters are creatures of our imagination. Right? There are no vampires, there are no zombies, right? They don't exist. We make them up. Or we put real things, real creatures, real people into the category of monster. So either way, we are creating either the category or the creature itself. So our monsters actually end up telling us a lot about us. Sometimes our monsters reveal our greatest fears and our greatest anxieties. Or at least the greatest fears and anxieties of the cultures that produce them, the cultures that tell these particular kinds of stories. And sometimes our monsters, if we understand them correctly, right, we're listening to them, also warn us of dangers that lie ahead. I think for our contemporary moment, one of the most compelling warning monsters are the monsters that spring from ecological disaster. Right? Godzilla, for example, is the very first eco monster, springing from ecological disaster, nuclear power, nuclear war. And Godzilla keeps emerging, right? Warning us about the destruction we ourselves will do to our own environment. So let's keep this in mind, this idea of monsters as being warnings, as well as monsters revealing to us something that we might not know or understand otherwise. Although we usually think of gods and monsters as separate, kind of diametrically opposed categories, they really are deeply intertwined in our imaginations and in our sacred texts, right? We've already kind of seen a little bit with cherubim. Our understandings of gods and monsters often go hand in hand, and the divine line between the two are not always so clear. So before we look even further at God's heavenly entourage, I want to show you one more slide with some definitions and theories on it. We begin class with these two scholars as well, Sigmund Freud and Rudolf Otto. Sigmund Freud, we all know Freud, right? I had a professor who once said Freud was often wrong, but always brilliant. Right? So we do still understand a lot about ourselves and the world because Freud uncovered certain kinds of things for us. So Freud explains monsters and gods, by the way, as I say in slide, in terms of psychological processes. Right? For him, the monster is always something within us that we don't like. Right? Something within us, either personally or in terms of our culture, that we don't want to admit is a part of us. And so we repress it. We repress it. And we project it outwards. Right? Of course, we all know what happens when you repress something, right? And that only gets you so far before it finally explodes, right? And that's the monstrous that emerges and returns. The repressed always returns for Freud. But that's not the only way to think about the monstrous, and certainly in my class, it's not the only way we think about it. We can also look at Rudolf Otto. So both of these men are vaguely contemporaneous, right? Sigmund Freud was Austrian, Otto Lutheran, actually, Lutheran theologian and philosopher. And Rudolf Otto has a slightly different understanding, in part because, if you know anything about Freud, you probably know Freud doesn't actually believe in God or monsters, right? Freud is an atheist. He understands everything in terms of psychological, psychoanalytical processes. Rudolf Otto, though, is a theologian. He's a Lutheran minister. He thinks these things exist. He doesn't think vampires exist or werewolves exist. He thinks evil exists, right? And he thinks God exists. And for him, the experience of both God and monsters is the same. Both inbreak from out there into our world. And it's overwhelming to us, right, this inbreaking. And it's this experience of coming into contact with something that is wholly other than what we are as creatures, as human creatures, that fill us with awe, terror, fear. And think of awe in terms of, right, awful, but also awesome, right? The way we can use that word in both ways. So the sacred and the monsters both exist independently from us, and we experience them in very similar ways as they break into our reality. Any comments or questions so far? Do you either resonate with one or the other understandings of the monsters?
I'm just thinking about the beginning of Genesis when male angels start having sex with female humans,
Yes.
creating monsters and not monsters, it says heroes and...
They're called the Nephilim.
Yes, the Nephilim, right.
Which means kind of fallen ones.
Right.
And they're called giants, the heroes of renown.
And that's why God decides to flood the earth and kill everybody.
Can't have giants.
No. Yeah.
But that's a great example of angelic beings not acting like we would think they're supposed to act, right? We don't normally think of angels having sex, right? But the Bible seems to suggest that the number one sex crime is having sex with angels, right? Because if you have sex with angels, what happens? The entire world gets destroyed. If you're more familiar with the New Testament, most scholars think Paul picks this up in 1 Corinthians, right? Where Paul's talking about whether or not women should cover their heads during worship. And he gives a bunch of different explanations for this. He's like, well, like a word from the Lord, right? If Jesus would have told him something, or if he knew something from Jesus, he usually says, well, I get this from the Lord. So clearly Paul's just kind of making stuff up on the fly here. But his very last line is, and because of the angels. So a lot of people read that as Paul being concerned with angels looking down at human women and getting, interested.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so he wants to protect both the angels and the women and any horrible stuff that might happen from that by having women cover their heads in worship. Right? Apparently this is pretty hot to the angels. So, yes, the Bible, almost from the very beginning, has heavenly creatures acting in ways that we at least don't normally think that those creatures should be acting. Anyone guess what these are? Attempted renditions. So, cherubim are the guards, right? And they look really scary. But in the Bible, they mostly just brandish swords and fly around God's throne. Right? They don't do anything that's particularly horrifying. Right? They just look scary. The seraphim, however, well, that's another story. The seraphim do not show up much in the Bible, but when they do, wow. Much like the cherubim, it is difficult to kind of picture them, right? And you can see a couple of different artistic ways of trying this. This one, I really like this one. This is actually carved into the side of the YMCA in Jerusalem. And there you get the images, I think, mostly from Isaiah, which has seraphim around God's throne. And the seraphim have 6 wings, 2 of which cover their faces, 2 of which cover, and 2 of which cover their feet. Feet is often a euphemism in the Hebrew Bible, especially for male genitalia. Right? So the idea is that they might be, covering their private parts with 2 of their wings. Here you also have the multiple wings, but here, of course, you have something that looks more like a snake. And the images and the descriptions of seraphim are, much like the cherubim, really hard to bring together. They're not very coherent. They're hard for us to imagine. There's a lot going on with them. But the seraphim do not show up just to guard God. They also show up in some very frightening stories. So I want to show you the main story that they show up in, besides Isaiah, where they're around the heavenly throne. This story is also going to show you how a lot of English translations try to make things look a little nicer. Right? They don't necessarily want to show how raw and how frightening the Hebrew can be. So this is a story, and if you know anything about Numbers, almost the entire book of Numbers, Israelites are wandering around, they're in the desert for 40 years, they're in the wilderness, and lots of things happen to them. They often, because they're in the wilderness for 40 years, they often complain, right? I would, you would, probably most of us would complain if we were stuck in the desert for 40 years. So here we have them complaining. They don't like the wilderness. They have no food and they have no water. And apparently manna from heaven, even though we use that phrase to talk about nice things, right? Apparently manna is crappy food. I really like this food. I don't know what the hell you're doing, but it's not very good. So instead of addressing their perhaps reasonable concerns, right, God just sends a bunch of poisonous snakes to attack. Right? But the word here in Hebrew is not poisonous snake. Translators warning message, right? Out of nowhere, you are suddenly overwhelmed by a mass of flying snakes that are hitting you and burning you when they do. And many of you die from these attacks. Yeah, luckily Moses has a way to cure it, right? But it doesn't take away from this really pretty traumatic event. When we read biblical stories, sometimes it's very easy to domesticate them, or, it comes from the Bible, so it can't be all that bad. But if we use our imagination to really put ourselves into this situation, right, there's really nothing about this story that isn't utterly terrifying. So if we think of a monster, and Sarah, I think, kind of get both of these definitions, right? As something that both looks scary, right? Looks different, looks in a way that we cannot really comprehend, that isn't legible, and as something that acts in a frightening and violent manner, right? They're killing by burning here. Then doesn't this mean that a seraph is a monster? And if they are monsters, not only because of how they look and how they act, what does this mean about God, right? Who not only created the seraphim, God controls the seraphim, and God sent them to terrorize and kill this group of people struggling in the wilderness. So these are the questions that we really explore in my class. And the questions become more acute when we turn to our next monster in God's heavenly entourage, the adversary. More commonly called the Satan or just Satan. Now, I could do a whole session on this figure, and I have done a whole session on this figure before. Actually, did 2 sessions at First Presbyterian Church in Knoxville just last year, because they wanted to hear more about it. So this is a really complex figure, and one that developed over a really long period of time. So when when most people think about religion or the Bible or theology, right, they don't think about the ways in which those ideas developed. All ideas, even ideas that we believe in, the core of our being to be true with a capital T. There was a time and there was a place when nobody had thought of that before. Somebody had to first think of it, and then somebody else had to add to that idea. And the idea develops, right, across time and across place. Usually when we think of Satan today, if I said something about Satan, most people would say that Satan is a supernatural figure, and that Satan rules over a place called hell, that Satan is opposed to God and attempts to thwart God's purposes, and that Satan is in many ways a complete manifestation of evil and suffering in the world. Right? Sounds familiar, I'm sure. But there was a time, right, when people didn't think that way about Satan. And so when we look at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, we don't find that image of Satan at all. Instead, we actually don't have very much on Satan in the entire Hebrew Bible, the entire Old Testament. There are only 4 passages, the whole thing. I usually, for students, I'll put them on a piece of paper, and I'll be like, this is all, right? This is the whole thing with Satan. Now, of course, when you get to the New Testament, Satan's all over the place. Satan is a full-blown figure that is opposed to God, is trying to thwart God's purposes, but it's not what we find in the Old Testament. The word Satan actually just means, in Hebrew, hasatan, satan, it just means adversary. So it's used to refer to human adversaries. David apparently has a lot of them. That's where you find most of the instances of this word. David has a lot of foes. But again, as I said, 4 instances, this word is applied to one of God's angels. One of his B'nai Elohim, right, as it says in the book of Job, one of the sons of God. There are English translation issues here, too. So, the first place the Satan or a Satan shows up is actually Numbers 22. That's the story of Balaam and the talking donkey. Right? So, if you're familiar with that story, you might be thinking, I don't remember Satan in that story. And you wouldn't unless you were looking at the Hebrew, because the English translation changes it. Right? It doesn't say Satan at all. In that story, Balaam is a prophet. He is on his way to curse the Israelites. He's not an Israelite. He's being sent by the king of Moab. So it's another one of these wilderness wanderings. Right? Those poor Israelites. Right? So he's being sent to curse the Israelites, and he's riding a donkey. And kind of in the middle of nowhere, his donkey stops and won't move anymore, won't move further. And so he's beating his donkey still won't move, he's beating his donkey, and suddenly his donkey can talk. Right? It's one of 2 talking animal stories in the Bible. Suddenly his donkey says, what are you doing? Have I been, do I usually behave this way? I'm not a bad donkey. Right? I don't usually behave this way, but there is something blocking my path. And suddenly Balaam can see that what's blocking his path is a Satan. That is the Hebrew. That God has sent a Satan to block Balaam's path so that he cannot curse. Right? And again, it's never translated that way. The next story, and this one I have up here, is from Job. Now, the book of Job, we could also spend an entire session on, right? Very complicated book, very troubling book in many ways. The book of Job opens with Job, right, who's wonderful, and Ishtam, as it says in Hebrew, a perfect man, and he's got lots of kids, and he's got lots of stuff, and God's bragging on him. All right, so God's hanging out in heaven, bragging on Job. When suddenly, the Satan comes around and says, does Job obey God for nothing? If you take away his stuff, he will curse you. And so God says, that's an interesting game you were suggesting to me, Satan. Let's go. And so God allows Satan to take away all of Job's things, including kill all of Job's children. And when Job still doesn't curse God, Satan says, well, of course, because he still has his health. If you let me take away his health, then you curse. So God says, great, go for it. Right? And Satan inflicts Job with terrible, painful boils. So what's the moral of this story? Right? Don't be good. You don't want to attract God's attention. In most translations, it's what you see here. Right? That one day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And then it goes on from there. But what might be a more accurate translation is this. Satan is not a proper name in the book of Job. It's a title, the Satan, which can be translated as the accuser or the adversary. It's not a proper name. It doesn't have a capital letter. There are no capital letters in Hebrew. Nothing has a capital letter in Hebrew. And in fact, heavenly beings is sons of God. So what we have here is a member of God's heavenly court, one of God's sons. And it seems to me that the role of this particular figure is to ask questions, to play devil's advocate, right, if you will, to probe, and to sometimes thwart human purpose, but always under the control of God. Have people read the book of Job before? Yeah, I mean, what do we make of that characterization of God? Right?
I can't stand the book of Job. Nothing about it I like. Nothing.
It's not how we usually like to think of God, right?
No.
Like, oh, I know. I'm going to send, this is terrible. I'm going to send a shooter into a school to kill a bunch of kids just to see what their parents are doing. Right? That's the kind of God in the book of Job. And it's terrifying. It's horrifying. And if you read through to the end, right, Job does get an audience with God. Right? God appears out of the whirlwind. Because Job, for 40 chapters, has been saying, I didn't deserve this. I want an explanation. God finally does come. But does God really give him an explanation? And it's not like God says, funny story, Job. I was hanging out in heaven, and then Satan came by. Right? He doesn't say that. Instead, he just overwhelms Job with all of this talk of creation. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Right? It's like sarcastic God. It's like the parent God coming down and saying, well, because I said so.
Yeah.
But then, at the very, very end, Job's friends, who had been defending God the whole time, who kept telling Job, God wouldn't do this to you if you didn't deserve it. The whole time. They ended up punished by God at the end. Because they did not speak about God that which was right. But Job did. So there you've got this twist, right, at the very end, where the right thing to do in horrific situations is to yell at God. That's what God wants you to do. Not just say, everything happens for you. It's a very complicated book. Very complicated. And this figure of the Satan, right, plays this really key role here, right at the beginning. God certainly doesn't fit within most of our theological ideas. I'm going to guess if you think about God, if you believe in God, if you worship God, this is not the God, right, that you worship. But the way that God is characterized in the Bible, the way that ancient peoples thought about God, often doesn't fit with our ideas and our notions. Are monsters evil? And if so, what does that make the entity that creates these monsters? Or the entity that creates evil? This is a line from Isaiah. That's good, right? I form light, and I create darkness. Right? This is the Creator God speaking through Isaiah. I make weal, and I create woe. I, the Lord, do all these things. But here's the thing. This is another translation issue. Weal and woe are great English words. They are not Hebrew words. This is what it says in Hebrew. I make peace, and I create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. We're in very troubling waters indeed with this verse. So before I close my discussion and my presentation and open up for more discussion, compassion, though, I do want to emphasize an important point that may be lost because all of the figures I've been looking at are from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Right? In many ways, it's easy, especially from a Christian perspective, to say, well, that was the God of the Old Testament, right? The God of wrath and violence and even evil, right? If we look at this line. But our God is different, right? Our God is a God of forgiveness and compassion and love. That's easy to say, but it's not really accurate. Right? First, because there's lots of passages in the Hebrew Bible about God being full of compassion and forgiveness and love. Right? I'm pulling out some of the more troubling passages, but the Hebrew Bible is a pretty big book. There's a lot more in it. Second, a Christian can only make that statement if they stop reading before they get to the book of Revelation. Here, for example, are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Revelation readers out there? Any big Revelation readers? Do you know?
Mm-hmm.
Steve, of course. That's his professional duty.
Yeah.
To read the book of Revelation. When John of Patmos begins to have his visions, he first sees a vision of Jesus, right? That's so frightening, he falls down as if he were dead. And in fact, that's what often happens when people encounter angels in the Bible, right? The very first thing the angel has to say is, don't be afraid, right? You can imagine what they must look like. Next, John is brought into the heavenly throne room, where things do not get any better. We see cherubim here, we see elders, we see lampstands, and we see a lamb standing, and I'm quoting here, as if it had been slaughtered, having 7 horns and 7 eyes. Right, again, it's hard to even picture, because that's not what lambs look like. And I'm always trying to think, like, what does it mean that a lamb is looking as if it were slaughtered, right? Is its throat cut? Is blood streaming down? Is its head kind of like askew, held on by just a few, muscles, or I don't even know what? This lamb, of course, is Jesus. Right? Not the most comforting image of Jesus here. Later, Jesus will appear in Revelation clothed in white, but his white cloak is covered in blood, and a 2-edged sword shooting out of his mouth. Right? So much for Jesus being alive. While in the throne room, John is able to watch the beginning of the end. And the first monsters of destruction that God releases are these. Right? The white horse of conquest, the red horse of war, the black horse of plague, and the final green horse or pale horse, depending on how you translate the Greek word or a Greek noun, the horse of death. You see that one at the very end. Hades follows with that horse. Hell, Satan himself, right? Is God actually unleashing Satan at this point? It's unclear. And these 4 horsemen are given the authority to kill 1/4 of the world's population through violence, famine, plague, and wild animal attack. Doesn't sound so fun. Who then is the monster here? The horsemen who bring with them unspeakable terrors and onto an unexpected population? Or the one who created, summoned, and unleashed the horsemen? As we get into the book of Revelation, it becomes particularly difficult to distinguish God from the monsters. And so I conclude. Not with a definitive statement or summary, as if we have asked and answered all the questions, but instead I conclude with the questions with which I began. The people who imagined God and his heavenly entourage in this way and wrote what has been given to us as the Bible lived in a complicated and unpredictable world. Disease, famine, accident, violence could erupt into this world at any moment without warning. The same is true even for us. Even with our science and our weather forecasting and our modern medicines and our nation states and our social safety nets, it is because we have so much and feel so comfortable that we sometimes forget that it can all be taken away in a moment. So our first questions were these. What is a monster? Does something or someone get labeled a monster because of how it looks? What appearance is considered monstrous? Or does something get labeled a monster because of how it acts? And what acts would be monstrous acts? And what does it even all mean? So thank you.
Hold on, let me turn this on. Comments and questions?
Over here.
Yes, hello, thank you. A long time ago, as a member of the Lutheran Church in Dayton, Ohio, I was asked to do a program on the Book of Revelation. I really didn't think I was qualified to do that, but because I had a reputation in the community of knowing how to work with dreams and the symbology of dreams and how it related to our subconscious motivations, I have been sort of a student of Carl Jung, working with symbols of the unconscious and the shadow. So I dove into it rather naively, and it took me a long time to really try to get a better understanding of the symbolism in that book. So it took me back into all kinds of literature, the Old Hebrew, the Book of Daniel, particularly the Book of Daniel, and the Apocrypha. A lot of the books that were not even recognized as official liturgy books in the Lutheran Church at the time. So after months of study, I finally realized that we're really dealing here with a symbolic language, and we have to understand the history of the times and how people communicated without the written word. They're dealing with symbols, things they can draw. This is before the Gutenberg press, before writing became popular. So we have to look at it from that point of view, from the historical perspective, as you are illustrating. But given that aside, I still feel there's a lot of symbolism here that we're not fully comprehending. And it really relates to our subconscious being. Where does that go? How does that relate to the idea of God? Where does that relate to the idea of evil? I think it relates more to our origin in the very beginning of time. I don't know quite how religion fits into all this, but I see this as an evolution of understanding of the human personality.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, just think of the monster, right? What is it revealing? Right? What do these reveal? Right? About the community that told us, but also about the communities that continue to tell us.
Other comments? Peter Singer's a ethicist who works a lot with environmental. He would say that humans are the monsters.
Yes.
That we are the cancer destroying the world. Yeah. Who else has a comment?
One angle in the book of Job, which helped me read it differently and made it a little more palatable. Maybe. Many people read Job and they read through the friends who are coaching and giving such lousy pastoral care. as they try to insist why this is happening. But somebody, and I wish I knew who it was, looked at the book of Job from a different angle and said, maybe that book is really about not the source or cause of suffering and evil. Maybe the book is asking about the nature of God. What kind of God do we have that allows this sort of stuff to happen to somebody like Job? What is God's character if God allows that to happen? After 20 years in pastoral ministry in hospitals, it's a very timely question that is being asked a lot today. What is the nature of God who brings peace and evil? Both. So looking at Job from that angle, it's like looking at a precious stone through a different facet. You get a little different picture of what may be going on. And that helped me read Job. Maybe it'll help other people read Job too.
Wait, are there others who, before we come to you a second time, maybe else have a comment or a question or want to share?
What is it, the nature of God or the nature of how we evolved as human beings from the elemental sources of elemental life? It may not be God at all, but how evolution produced life in the first place.
God gets blamed a lot for stuff. Other comments? Questions? Oh, very good.
I'm not quite sure how to put this, but when we were talking about Freud and Rudolf Otto, I saw a combination of the two. They each seem to be firm in their particular position. I think there is a blending of those two. I think sometimes external forces can create monsters of people, and people who act as monsters can they can affect the community. I think we're seeing some of that being played out right now, without being political. But I think there's a lot being played out now in terms of the external being thrust upon lots of folks, and so that the impetus for us is how do we react to that? Do we become monsters ourselves? Or do we take a different path? And I'm not sure what the answer is to that.
The other thing about angels is there are no explicitly female angels in the Bible.
They're not. They're masculine.
In my, growing up, I attended a Protestant church with my family. And I guess I believed the way the church taught me to believe. Now I don't have a clear idea of what God is. But it must be in the nature of God to create. And for God to create this, I even heard already, God created us because he was lonely. But there's like dualities here. There's like night and day. So I think maybe that's the basis. It's not that God wants evil or creates evil being, whatever. I'm not sure, but I'm just thinking it has to do with the dualities here in a three-dimensional world.
That connects to Carl Jung as well, right? Because he understood archetypes, right? And these different archetypes that were oppositely balanced.
monsters. I hate scary stuff.
Well, thank you for coming.
Don't talk me into that. I do. I won't watch scary stuff. I hate that. But I just watched the movie Substance, which is up for Academy Award with anymore. And I had no idea that it was going to be, I would have never watched it. But it's interesting because I don't know if anybody's seen it or not, but she transforms into this horrendous monster as she tries to more and more keep her youth and beauty. And I think, I guess what I'm trying to say is, this is someone's depiction of a monster. It's disgusting, but it's just someone's depiction, just as these are. You know, it's how somebody read the Bible and then gave it a picture of what they thought it was.
You know, people trying to make sense of their realities. Right?
When my son was 5, we were hiking, and I said, just be careful, you know, because step on a snake might bite you. And he says, snakes are bad. I said, no, snakes are just living out their snakiness. Right? They're not bad, they're just snakes. And if they bite you, it's their nature. So the question of what a monster is it's not cut and dry. Other comments, questions? We want everyone to have a chance.
As a therapist who works with people using brain states and EEG traces and other things like that, what we're finding is that there are certain states of brainwaves that are personification of that picture. Like there's high beta, which is where we go when we ruminate, and when we're there, we want to hurt, kill, or destroy. Anything in our way, just like all these awful images here. And there's no solution in that state because it takes a picture of the evil, it blows it up, it pastes it to your forehead, so that's all you can see. And then when you drop down into alpha, theta, and delta, which are peaceful states, and the bottom state especially, is the awareness of the presence of God. When people enter delta, all of this disappears. And they're left with a wonderful peace and a resolution, and this is when spiritual healing occurs, and the physical body just heals in a great big hurry. So there's a lot going on there, there's a lot to parse, and we're just beginning to figure out the biochemistry of it all, but there's something in there that helps us explain this old mythology and what can we do to prevent the world from being that way. And right now we're not doing a very good job, but there's always the future.
Thank you. Others?
I'm not sure how to explain our penchant for being scared. Producers, directors, etc. continue to make scary movies because people go to them. People like being scared. Not everyone, but there are people who like being scared. And I wonder if some of that has to do with two things. One, it kicks in your endorphins, which actually makes you feel better in the long run. And second is, thank goodness that was just a movie.
It's like a dream.
Reality is not so bad when you compare it to what's going on in a horror film or whatever. So, without the benefit of film, some of this takes that on.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the Bible, it's not like somebody sat down and said, I am now going to write sacred scripture, right? I mean, people are just writing stories. And stories are one of the primary ways in which we communicate, but also the primary ways we entertain each other. And so there's a real entertainment value to a lot of these biblical stories that now get the stamp of sacred, but certainly would not have been thought of as sacred when they first emerged and circulated. Right? We do like to be scared.
Others? Someone else have something?
No, just when you were saying, it's also like waking up from a nightmare and going, oh my God, that wasn't real. Oh,
Right.
I believe. Yeah.
Right.
all, it is really comforting. Because you'd much rather have a God in control, even if that God is controlling horrific things, than to have chaos. Right? Than to have something horrible happen to you randomly. Right? For no reason.
The frightening thing to me, though, is how many people, especially in this country, a certain flavor of Christianity, want these monsters to be real, and they want to work to bring about a reality that will destroy everything. They're pining for Armageddon, and I don't understand that kind of theology and psychology that wants to burn everything to the ground.
Yep.
To piggyback on your comment, the Hebrew scriptures have a book called Lamentations. The Christian scriptures do not. What happened? In the Hebrew scriptures, people looked at the world and said, this is okay, this is not. This is wrong, this is unacceptable, this is evil, or whatever. In the Christian scriptures, we don't have that. Why? What was the shift? The shift was, in much of the Christian scriptures, whatever happens is supposed to happen. God wanted that to happen. So, if God wanted it to happen because God is bringing something better out of it, or this was God's plan, or whatever, then there is no need to lament what is happening, because everything that is happening was supposed to happen. And so, because of the change in mindset, we have lamentations in the Hebrew scriptures, but there's nothing to lament in the Christian scriptures, because everything that's happening is supposed to happen. What would happen if maybe some Christians wrote a book of Christian lamentations? I'd love to read it.
Yeah, me.
Well, you raise a really interesting point. I do a lot of research in psychology, precognition, and all that. And some of the experiments my colleagues and I have been involved in show that the future actually can be predicted to a certain degree. So if that's true, then things are predetermined. And that does not go contrary to free will. How do we reconcile that? You know, I'm in a real quandary. In fact, right now, I'm in the middle of a big experiment. I just won a major research grant to look into precognition. You know, on one hand, I believe it, on the other hand, I don't. So I'm puzzled, just like maybe you seem to be at times as well. How do you reconcile this dichotomy between the future's fixed and your free will?
You either have free will or you don't. Are there other questions? Take that for other questions or comments? But just anybody here because we want to give everybody a chance to say something, and not just us.
There's this, there's a Jewish tradition of arguing with God.
Oh, yeah.
Right, and it's rooted in Abraham. Right, because when Abraham got his heavenly visitors, and they told him, we're going to go destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because there's a lot of bad people there. Abraham actually argues with them. Right, he says, look, will you destroy all, even the good and the bad? Right, what if you find 30 good people? And God's like, oh, okay, for 30 good people, I will destroy the city. So Abraham's like, okay, what about 20? And God's like, oh, okay, 20. And then he's like, okay, what about 10? Okay? And so he argues God down into saving the city if he can find at least 10 people. And he says it by saying, should not the judge of all the world do what is just? Right? Should not the judge of all the world do what is just? And this is actually seen as a really important story in Judaism. And in fact, Noah ends up condemned by the rabbis in a lot of stories. Why? Because when God came to Noah and said, I'm going to destroy the world, what did Noah say? Okay. But Abraham argued.
It's probably what we have.
And Abraham did the right thing, and Noah did the wrong, in that understanding.
The origin of kibitzing.
Yes.
Yeah.
One always needs to.
Others? Well, we want to say thank you so much. It was really wonderful, fascinating. We have a whole lot of people online checking it out, and we will post this on our Spirit on Tap YouTube channel. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Next month, Rabbi Michelson is going to be with us, Brian Michelson. He's going to be talking about what it's like to be a Jew in America during increased anti-Semitism. And what's the date on that? Because I have that on my phone. My phone is still recording. So
Fourth Tuesday.
the fourth Tuesday in March. So we hope you'll spread the word and join us for that. Thank you.
Just one more thing.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
For those of you who know Harry Serio, he is not here tonight. He's not well. So he has to undergo